Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. I'm really glad you're tuning in today because we've got an absolutely staggering story to unpack. Today we're diving into the life of a man who fought literal and ideological battles for his country, basically standing right at the violent intersection of profound patriotism and pervasive systemic prejudice. We're going to break down the history of Daniel Inouye. He was a soldier whose unyielding loyalty totally redefined what it means to serve the United States. His story is complex, it's heavy, and honestly, it's just endlessly fascinating. So let me ask you a question to start us off. How do you prove your loyalty when your country locks up your family? I really want you to keep this paradox in your mind throughout this entire explainer, because this is the exact impossible situation that Japanese Americans faced after their world abruptly and violently broke apart. Just imagine the psychological toll of that. How do you even respond when the nation you call home suddenly decides you're the enemy?
All right, to really understand how this all unfolded, we got to go back to December 7th, 1941. Picture this. It's a Sunday morning, and a 17-year-old Japanese-American kid named Daniel Inouye is getting dressed for church in Honolulu, Hawaii. Out of nowhere, the roaring engines of low-flying Japanese warplanes completely shake the morning air. Inouye could actually see the red rising sun painted on their wings as they violently targeted Pearl Harbor. And in that single catastrophic moment, the whole world Inouye knew just broke apart. He obviously couldn't foresee it quite yet, but this tragedy was going to deeply impact his future, because almost overnight, his own country would look at people with his face, his heritage, and categorize them as enemy aliens.
In the months right after the Pearl Harbor attack, this intense, overwhelming fear just gripped the United States, and it drove the government to execute a massive systemic removal. They rounded up more than 110,000 Japanese Americans. And it's absolutely crucial to point out here that the vast majority of these individuals were legal American citizens. But the government forced them out of their homes, pulled kids out of their schools, and completely stripped them of their businesses. They were shipped off to remote internment camps, locked away behind barbed wire. Now, despite all of this intense suspicion, Daniel Inouye's response was totally remarkable. Over in Hawaii, the wholesale population removal was handled a bit differently than on the mainland, but trust me, the prejudice was just as pervasive. Patriotic young Nisei men, that's second-generation Japanese Americans like Inouye, were classified as unfit to fight. They were barred from military service purely because of their ancestry. And Inouye was deeply insulted by this. The implication that he couldn't be trusted to defend his own homeland, it stung. But he didn't let it turn into bitterness. During the initial Pearl Harbor panic, he had already jumped in to serve his community as a trained Red Cross medical aide, calmly treating bleeding and wounded sailors. So instead of giving up, he joined thousands of other Japanese American youths in petitioning the government. They wanted the right to fight. And they fought for this right not because the nation had treated them fairly, but because it was still their country. They wanted to prove their loyalty with their own blood.
Okay, so this brings us to 1943. The government finally shifts its policy and creates a segregated Japanese-American unit. They called it the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Their motto? Go for broke. It's an old Hawaiian-born gambling term that basically means to risk absolutely everything on one massive effort. And man, that is exactly what they did. Dropping his pre-med studies, Inouye enlisted immediately. But we really can't overlook the agonizing irony here. Inouye and these other Nisei soldiers were training in United States military uniforms, literally preparing to risk their lives for America, while many of their own parents were still locked behind barbed wire back home.
And let me tell you, the combat record of the 442nd, it is legendary. They deployed to Europe and fought with an unyielding ferocity right through brutal mud, heavy artillery fire, and these incredibly highly fortified mountain defenses in Italy and France. They even famously rescued the trapped Lost Battalion from Texas. It was a grueling mission that cemented the 442nd as one of the most highly decorated units for its size and duration in the entire history of the U.S. Army. During all this intense combat, Inouye really proved his exceptional leadership. He quickly rose to the ranks to become a second lieutenant, taking on this massive responsibility for the lives of the men under his command. All of this builds to what has to be one of the most intense, almost cinematic moments in military history. The date is April 21st, 1945. We're near the village of Santorenzo in Italy, and this is just days, literally days, before the war in Europe would officially end. Inouye is leading his platoon against this heavily fortified German ridge, and we're not talking about a simple hill here. It was guarded by 3 interlocking machine gun nests, specifically designed to catch anyone approaching in a deadly crossfire. And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. His men were completely pinned down by heavy enemy fire.
What happens next is, well, it's almost unbelievable.
First off, while they're pinned down, Inouye gets struck in the torso by an enemy bullet. But does he evacuate? No way. He fiercely refuses and instead crawls forward alone. Next, using hand grenades and his submachine gun, he single-handedly takes out the first machine gun position. He keeps pushing forward and successfully neutralizes the second position too. Now he's crawling toward the final bunker. He raises his right arm to hurl a live armed grenade. But right before he can throw it, a German rifle grenade strikes his right elbow. It completely shatters the bone, nearly severing his right arm from his torso. And when Inouye looks down at his ruined arm, he sees something truly terrifying. His fingers are completely shattered, yet they're still tightly clenched around a live armed grenade. I mean, just take a second and try to imagine that reality. Knowing his men are exposed right behind him, Inouye screams for them to stay back. Then, in just an act of unfathomable willpower, he uses his left hand to agonizingly pry the live explosive from his own unyielding right fingers. He throws the grenade with his left hand and successfully destroys that final German bunker. And you know what? Even then, he doesn't stop. He continues to fire his weapon one-handed until a final burst of enemy fire tears into his legs and he finally collapses. He saved his platoon, but the doctors, they did not expect him to survive a torn torso, a nearly severed arm, and mangled legs. But against all odds, he did survive. It took countless surgeries and 2 absolutely grueling years of hospital recovery, though. He returned home to rebuild his life with only one arm, which meant his original dream of becoming a surgeon was permanently shattered. Now, for this incredible, almost superhuman heroism, Inouye was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. That's the nation's second highest military honor. But you might be wondering, why the second highest? Well, it's because at the time, pervasive prejudice prevented the military from recognizing Asian American soldiers with the Medal of Honor, which is the ultimate award. So even after literally shedding his blood and losing his arm for his country, systemic discrimination still put a ceiling on his recognition. You'd think he'd be bitter, right? But Inouye completely refused to go down that path. After the battle in 1945, he pivoted his life entirely toward public service. He studied law, and in 1959, as soon as Hawaii gained statehood, he became one of the state's very first members of Congress. He'd actually go on to serve as a highly respected United States senator for nearly 50 years. Then, decades later, a formal military review finally investigated whether discrimination had unjustly denied Asian American veterans their rightful honors during World War II. And finally, on June 21, 2000, which is a staggering 55 years after he charged that ridge in Italy, President Bill Clinton awarded Daniel Inouye the Medal of Honor. When Daniel Inouye finally stood there at the White House to receive that medal in the year 2000, he wasn't just standing there as an individual. He stood as a living witness for all the families who sent their sons to bleed for a country that was actively keeping them behind barbed wire. His life really embodies this heavy, undeniable truth. He was a soldier forced to fight 2 wars simultaneously. He had one war against the enemy forces entrenched on a ridge in Italy, and a second invisible war against the profound prejudice of the very country he was dying to defend. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final thought to chew on. What is the true cost of patriotism when you have to fight the prejudice of the very country you are dying to defend? Daniel Inouye literally risked everything. He went for broke to prove his loyalty, sacrificing his body and his dreams in the process. And it took over half a century for his country to fully and properly recognize the sheer magnitude of what he gave. I hope you take some time today to just reflect on this defining chapter of civil rights and military history. Ask yourself what true, unyielding loyalty really looks like. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.